Hello, everybody. Welcome to Community Conversations. My name is Courtney Shah, and I am the facilitator of the series, and I'm also awkwardly the speaker today. So I have deputized a couple of my compatriots here to help out. So thank you to Chris and Adam. Thank you to Jacob for bringing some books. So the Learning Commons, the LCC Learning Commons is here. If you want to check out some related materials, you can check out the back row there. I also have some flyers in the back, both for this series as well as for the Vest Memorial Lecture, which we're going to be holding on Thursday, May 11th. That's next week at 7 p.m. We have Dr. Rebecca Thorpe from the University of Washington coming, so you can pick up a flyer for that if you are interested. Those events are open and free to the public. And next week in this series, so at 11:30 next Thursday, we have Ryan Marr and Douglas Detrick, who are going to be speaking on community-guided creativity. So looking at art and music and how those cultural aspects are built in a community. So please join us for that as well. But today, I'm going to be talking about an aspect of culture that I've always been fascinated by. And so for those of you who have taken my History 137, you will have heard a little bit of this ahead of time, but I'm going to expand it. I'm going to look at dating culture and basically largely the culture of romance in America from courting to dating and how that developed. And there's a couple of things I need to say at the outset of this. Number one, you are not here for dating advice. I am not an expert. Right? So keep that in mind. I am a historian. If you want to know what things were like back in the day, that's my job. If you want to know how to find a significant other today, I am not good at that. So don't come to me for that information. Number two, this talk might get a little PG-13. I don't see any youngins in the audience today, but if we're talking about romance and dating, we may also talk about canoodling and some PG-13 related activities. So just keep that in mind. If that is a problem for you, the doors are back there. This is college, right? Okay. Now, one of the things that I was really pleased about to be presenting this talk was looking at how my topic relates to what Trey Beatty said in week 1 on his primer on culture, what culture is. And he talked about how culture is group behaviors and practices. And it's about the whole of society rather than about what an individual does. So we're looking at sort of larger patterns rather than individuals exercising individual choices. And our choices that we made are shaped by the culture that we are in. So in general, I'm going to be talking about a lot of the dominant culture in the United States. And so largely this is going to be very, very heterosexual. Obviously, that is not the only thing that's going on and has never been the only thing going on. So one thing to kind of keep in mind is how might people who don't fit into heterosexual courting and dating, how might they use that system in order to get what they are looking for? And that's an interesting question that historians sometimes struggle with because very often the documents, the sources are not as readily available to us as they are for mainstream male-female marriages and things like that. So our courting and dating rituals, looking at it from the dominant culture, we can also look at subcultures. And as we get closer to the present, we're going to see a lot of other subcultures that emerge that are working against that dominant culture and the cultural behaviors and how they adapt over time. So as our society changes, how does our cultural practice of romance, courting, and dating change as well? Okay, so that's laying out where we're going here. So what are our courtship rituals? If we look at the entirety of the United States, back from colonial times to the present, how do we find that special someone and how do we get together with them? What does that look like? And in general, we can look at courtship rituals in colonial America as the ways that we try to find our romantic partner. ways that we find the person that we want to marry. So what is the purpose of courting? Courting is to find a spouse. And that makes it different from dating. Dating is two people getting to know each other, and maybe this will get serious or maybe it won't. Doesn't really, you don't necessarily know on a first date or anything like that. Courting is much more purposeful towards the goal of matrimony. So courting is often done through the lens of the parents or through the lens of a religious community, etc. Whereas dating can be much more sort of independently geared towards many different purposes. And that could be, we could sort of frame this as courting is looking for Mr. Right and dating is looking for Mr. Right now. But I will say that dating sometimes can be, I am looking for Mr. Right now, but the longer I am with Mr. Right now, the more I realize he is Mr. Right. And so dating also leads to marriage very often. So these two things do have quite a bit of overlap as well. So we court in order to find a spouse. And why do we need a spouse? And this is something that is sort of has a long and glorious history throughout the world and over thousands of years. We find a spouse to survive and reproduce. And if we think about colonial America, especially, you are a farm family out on the frontier. Maybe you have a crop in the field and you have some livestock, and you want to have a person that, hopefully you love and you care for, but also somebody who's going to help you slaughter those pigs, somebody who's going to help you bring the crop in, somebody who's going to help you with the work of surviving. So marriage is to survive. It is the work necessary in order to get through the winter, right? That's a very crucial part of this. It is a survival strategy. We work better when we are in groups, especially back in colonial America. And we do this to reproduce. And there's a long and sometimes glorious history about why marriage is geared towards reproduction. It's for the transfer of wealth from one generation to another. So if you want inheritance law, it goes from the father to the eldest son in colonial America. And so if you know who that son is, that makes it a lot easier for dad to say, okay, I'm ready to pass the farm on to, Joey, because I know Joey is my kid. And how do you know Joey is your kid? Because you married Joey's mom. Doesn't always work like that. I've seen the Jerry Springer Show. But in general, the idea here is a clearly mapped out and legally defensible family structure that allows for the transmission of wealth from one generation to another. So you're reproducing, and that might be because you love children. That might be because birth control was fairly ineffective in the 18th or 19th century. But that could also be your religious community says that you should reproduce, go forth and multiply. And your family says, we want you to have kids. Where are my grandchildren? I want to have grandchildren, right? So you have pressures from all sorts of aspects of society to go out and find a spouse. And this is to survive and to reproduce. So marriage makes sense. Marriage is a legal entity, but it's also a cultural entity that makes the transmission of wealth, culture, family structure, religious beliefs from one generation to the next simpler and streamlined in a lot of ways. So then the real question becomes, what's love got to do with it, to quote Tina Turner? And I'm here to tell you the good news. Love has always had a lot to do with it. So we might think about colonial America, we might think about those people in the 1600s and how they are just looking to survive and they need to find a mate so that they can get through the winter and stuff. They were also very adamant that they wanted somebody that they liked. They wanted somebody they were attracted to. They wanted somebody that they got along with. And so love has always been an ideal. Now, that's not to say that every relationship had love. Clearly, some did not. But the ideal of love being a crucial portion of marital decisions has always been present in American history. So we can rag on the Puritans all we want. I do a lot of that in my classes, but Puritans wanted to marry for love. And so they're not all that different from us in a lot of ways. We might not be slaughtering pigs, with our spouse, but we do have some of the same ideals about marriage. So what's love got to do with it? A lot. We have always been seeking love. We're human beings. And that love can take a lot of different forms. That can be, friendly love. That can be somebody that I get along with, somebody that I can, sit on the couch and watch TV with. That can be somebody that I want to have sex with, right? All these different aspects of what we categorize as love have always been there in American history. So when we look at why people courted, why they purposefully got to know somebody in the hopes that this would be a marriage, this looks much larger at the idea of what marriage is about in society. And I talked about some of this already. It creates economic ties and partnerships. So if I were the daughter of a shopkeeper in colonial America, and there is another guy, there's a guy in my community who wants to be a shopkeeper, and he might want to find a spouse who's going to help him with that work, I might all of a sudden be much more attractive because I can write out a ledger. I can do some math. I have grown up around shopkeeping and I know how this works. Likewise, if I am a farm girl and I am, good at taking care of cows and chickens, then a farmer might find that very attractive because this is somebody who's going to help them with their work. This is somebody who understands them, that makes sense to them, and would make a good spouse. And so we can look at this and say, okay, well, are they in love? Well, maybe not. Maybe they have friendly feelings towards one another. Maybe they have a spark of attraction. But then we also have the idea that love will develop. Love will build over time. And courtship is often about that. It's often fast in colonial America. You don't necessarily court for years upon years upon years. You wanted to get going, Now, this is also, I'm going to pop a few myths here. Colonial Americans also did not overwhelmingly get married in their teenage years. The average age for women of marriage was around about 20 in colonial America. And for men, it was, 25 or 26 often. So these are adults. These are not kids getting married. My great-great-grandmother was on the Oregon Trail and she got married at 14. This is the late 19th century. That's an anomaly. That's not the usual practice of what we've seen in American history. We might often look at this and say, oh yeah, back then people got married super, super young. Not necessarily. Some did, but most did not. And part of the reason for that is because usually people didn't want to get married until they were financially secure. So a guy might not want to get married until he has inherited his farm. So maybe he waits till his dad passes away, or until he's given a gift of some land or some tools or something that's going to enable him to be financially independent so that he can take care of a wife and any children that are coming down the line. So people took a little bit of time to get to know somebody and hopefully to find out if they were compatible before they got married. But courtships were usually fairly quick. And one thing that I find very telling about this is in colonial America, you have, pretty high mortality rates. People did not live tremendously long lives, and especially mothers often lost their lives during childbirth, right? So you could have this young mother who's 22, 23, and she dies in childbirth, and all of a sudden her husband is now widowed and he's got kids. He's probably going to go out and find a new wife pretty quickly. And people often remarried within a year of losing their spouse. And that doesn't necessarily speak to this idea that they didn't love their spouses, but to the idea that having a partner makes the household work go quicker. If you are a widower and you've got 5 kids to take care of and your wife has just passed away, and let's be honest, in colonial America, you probably didn't have a tremendous amount of people saying, oh, you should probably be more of a hands-on dad. You should take care, you should change diapers. I mean, my dad was born in the 40s. And when my son was born, his response was, Grampies don't change diapers. I was like, well, Grampies from the 40s don't change diapers. Grampies nowadays might change diapers a little bit. But back then we had pretty clearly delineated ideas of what masculine labor was and what feminine labor was. And so in general, it was the ideal cultural practice to have one man and one woman to be able to do both halves of that labor to make a household go. And so if you lost your partner, you might seek a new partner pretty quickly because you want somebody to help you do that work. But who's to say you also don't want somebody to love? And I think there's something to be said for that, right? So there was a lot of love that goes into this, but there was also a lot of pragmatism that goes into this. So marriage is about running a household. Marriage is about children. Marriage is about inheritance. Marriage is also about forming alliances. And I found this very interesting. Stephanie Kuntz is a historian who talks about this a lot. This idea that when we create a marriage, we create in-laws. And this, we have a lot of jokes about, oh, mother-in-laws and stuff like that. But in-laws were a very important concept. This was building your extended family, building cultural ties, building economic ties, building relational ties that are going to help you in hard times. So if I have an extended family and I run upon hard times, and let's say my parents have passed away, but my spouse's parents haven't, they can help me out. Maybe my mother-in-law comes and stays with me and helps with the kids. And so in-laws were very crucial to the smooth running of a household when you are in need. And this helps to create stability. And really, that's what a lot of this is about, is the idea of stability, economic stability, religious stability, cultural and social stability, the idea that we want to move smoothly through the hard times and get to the other side and then recreate our culture for the next generation. And marriage is the cornerstone to that. So marriage helps to form all of these stable ideas. So if our goal is marriage and the way we get there is courting, what does courting actually look like? How do we find that special someone? And in rural America, in the colonial period and into the 1800s and stuff, this was generally speaking very localized, right? You had a community, maybe a group of farms in the area, or maybe a small town that was nearby. And generally speaking, as a rural community, people knew each other, right? Pretty much everybody knew who else lived in the area. And so you saw one another at market day, you saw one another at church on Sunday, you might have a faith community, you might have an economic community, you might have your neighbors. And these were the people that you interacted with, these were the people that you got to know. And so these are the people that were likely to be where your spouse would come from. And so if I grew up in a community and there were maybe only 3 or 4 eligible aged gentlemen in my neighborhood, those would be the first place I would look for, who is my spouse going to be? It's going to probably be one of these similarly aged men in my community. And if there weren't a lot of similarly aged men in my community, that's going to be a little bit of a problem. I might have to look a little bit older. I might have to look a little bit further away. But generally speaking, marriage was organized locally and within your own existing social circles. And one of the institutions that really helped with this was church. So church was something that gave people a place to go and meet and socialize with one another. And you often had church socials. You might have a dance. You might have a picnic. You might have like fundraising work or Sunday school or something where groups of people are gathering together in a social setting where they can get to know one another. And so it was through these organizations that we see people meet and get to know one another, perhaps grow up together. And then once they get a little older, somebody might catch your eye and you might think, okay, well, this is somebody that I'm interested in. And at that point, the man, and it is at this time very much the man who is the, I don't want to say aggressor, but the one who's taking the initiative to say, okay, I am interested in this person. I am going to go talk to her family and I'm going to begin the courting process, right? And so courting is often done through the lens of the faith community or I should say, the lens of the family. So he might ask the father's permission to court his daughter, or he might ask the young lady, would it be okay if I talk to your dad about courting you? And those would be ways in which it's basically made official that these two people are getting to know one another to see if they want to get married. And then if that goes smoothly, then you get betrothed. Then you are basically engaged to be married. And then whenever, he inherits the farm, then you might have the wedding. Or whenever you're financially ready to move out of your parents' houses, that is when you would have the wedding. Now, one thing that's very interesting and surprising to a lot of my students, and maybe surprising to you as well, is in general how accepting these communities were about premarital sex. This idea that once a couple is courting, and especially if they're betrothed, if there's a little hanky-panky going on, what's the big deal, right? If one of the goals of marriage is to have kids, maybe they're jumping the gun a little bit, but they're having kids. And there's all sorts of just amazing stats about how somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 25% of brides in colonial America were pregnant at the time of their wedding. I was shocked by that. We think of, oh, well, back then, nobody did anything until the wedding night. Silly. These are farm communities. They see livestock. They know how things work, right? They know what's up. And in fact, they really thought of this as one of the ways that they sort of made sure that they were compatible. And one thing that I found very interesting about this was another way also to sort of make sure, for a couple to make sure that their families would accept their relationships. So if I am courting Joey and it's going well, but maybe dad is on the fence and not sure that I should get together with this guy. Well, if I'm pregnant, well, then he's got it. Like, well, yes, you must get married, right? We don't want an unmarried, mother out here. That would be scandal. So yes, go ahead and get married. This was a way to speed up the process or to make sure that you got the person that you wanted to get. Because if dad's trying to set me up with, some rich merchant who's 50 years old, no offense to 50-year-olds, I'm 49-year-olds, but some older man who might have more money or something, and I'm not interested in him, I'm interested in, young Joey over here, then I might sort of stack the deck in my favor in order to get what I want out of the situation. Well, I'm pregnant with his kid. Clearly, we should get married. That is the right thing to do. And I don't want to marry this guy. This guy probably doesn't want to marry me if I'm pregnant with somebody else's kid. So there's some ways that couples might have used that as a strategy to either speed up matters or to get the partner that they were looking for. And in general, it wasn't seen as culturally shocking or scandalous or taboo for somebody to be pregnant at the time of their marriage. If they had the baby before they got married, that was a little more scandalous, right? We really would like you to go ahead and get married before you do this. But there's a lot of art that shows these very visibly pregnant women getting married. And that was pretty common. It wasn't the dominant way of doing things, but it was a fairly common happening. So the preference of the couple is desirable. Even their sexual compatibility was desirable because that was going to be better for the whole community. If we want these two to have babies together, then perhaps we want them to be sexually interested in one another because, I'm not here to teach biology, but if they're having sex, they're more likely to have kids than if they're not having sex. And you could actually get a divorce in colonial America on the grounds that your partner was not sleeping with you. And that happened. There's court cases. One of the great things about studying history is you read all these court cases about when things go wrong. And that's really juicy gossip a lot of the time. So women taking their husbands to court and saying, oh, he hasn't slept with me in a year. I don't want to be married to this guy anymore because he's not providing me what I require. And so you could say, yeah, you're not going to have babies this way. Let's get rid of this guy. And you could divorce that person and then try to get somebody else who is more compatible with you. So that's an interesting thing. And that also raises some questions about things like, well, what are gay or lesbian people doing during this time? Generally speaking, trying to fit in, trying not to raise any hackles of their community, but perhaps finding a person who's tolerant of the fact that maybe this won't be a sexual relationship. Maybe this will be a companionate relationship, or maybe we will have, we will have sex until we can produce a child, and then we can be done with that portion of the marriage, right? But the rest of the time, we can, essentially, you can have a beard. You can have, as in modern parlance, somebody who presents a couple that presents as a heterosexual couple when they might not be, right? So that was something that did happen. And you do see some court cases about that. This person is not fulfilling to me sexually, and therefore we need to get rid of them, right? And this raises one of the most fun examples of how this works. Has anybody heard the term bundling before? Yeah, I love this. This is great. So this is a practice that was common in the 18th century. It showed up in the movie The Patriot, which is in my opinion a garbage movie, but I did think it was funny that they brought out bundling. This was a common practice that couples who were courting could do, especially in wintertime, if, say, the young man is visiting the young woman's family, and it might be dangerous for him to travel back to wherever he came from in the snow and stuff like that. So he might stay the night. And these are cramped quarters. You don't necessarily have a guest room in your farmhouse. And so instead of making a big deal about this, you just put them in the bed together. But you have some sort of barrier that's going to prevent any hanky-panky from happening. So you see bundling boards, which is literally a wooden board dividing the bed in two, which is what's depicted here. You can see in the image a board between the man and woman, and also a crowd looking on to make sure they're not doing anything, because, you know, there's very little privacy in the world of the 18th century. Or bundling bags. They would sew the young couple into separate like cloth bags and like stitch them around their necks, so you can't move your arms and legs around too much, and you're also not going to be in actual physical contact with one another. Or they simply said, go to bed fully clothed. And this was a way that you could spend time together, that you could be physically close to one another, cuddle. Cuddling's nice, right? You're not necessarily having sex. Hopefully you're not having sex, although let's be honest, I'm sure some people figured out how to get that done. A bundling board, you can get around that pretty easily. But this was common practice. And the idea here is it's practical, right? If a couple wants to spend some time together and they are courting, then why not share a bed? We don't have a lot of space. It's hard to travel. This makes sense. And so much so that actually some communities still practice this. I read a little bit about how a community of Amish people in Nebraska still practices bundling. So it's very rare. This is not common amongst all Amish, but some people still do this. And it's sort of seen as this old-timey tradition that, of course, Amish people are hearkening back to the past. And they see this as something that, you know, deserves to stick around. So this was a common practice, if not necessarily something everybody did, at least something that was, you know, not unheard of for a lot of people. By the time we get to the 19th century, we start to see some of these ideals about courtship and marriage start to change. And we go from this idea of a short courtship where we're looking for somebody who's going to fulfill the economic needs of the marriage, and hopefully we think they're sexy and we want to, you know, get up close to them and stuff. This idea in the 19th century, especially in the quote unquote Victorian era, sort of the mid-century and forward here, is the idea of companionate marriage. And this is really raising the stakes of what marriage is supposed to give us. Marriage is not just this economic partnership. It's not just a reproductive partnership. It's also, you want this person to be your best friend. You want this person to fulfill all of your needs. And, you know, we could make a good argument to say that this is a little unrealistic to expect all your needs to be met by this one person. But there was, in the advice literature, in the romance novels, in all of that, think about Pride and Prejudice, think about Sense and Sensibility, this idea of not just somebody that you are sort of like, this guy's kind of hot, right? But this is somebody that I get along with. This is somebody that I respect and that I want to be around. And this is somebody that I can talk to. I think of Eleanor Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility as sort of a prime example of this. She is looking for an intellectual equal. She is looking for somebody that she can have conversations with. And that was very, very important. This idea of a companionate marriage where you're not just looking for a romantic partner, but you're looking for a friend. You're looking for a best friend. And this is actually a big step, because in general, we have sort of this notions in the 19th century that people are floating in two different worlds, right? Men are over here in the public realm. They are at work. They are at the tavern. They are at the political clubs. They're at the union clubs. And then women are at the home, right? They're in the private sphere. They're in the home. Maybe they're in their church ladies groups, but generally speaking, they're often sort of lady worlds, and the men are in man worlds. And there's not necessarily a whole lot of socialization and interaction between the two. And we have wonderful, wonderful letters that women wrote to one another about having their friends come to visit them. Carol Smith Rosenberg wrote a wonderful article talking about how these young women wrote about their best friends, their female best friends, and said, I want you to come to visit. One of them talks about her best friend from school is going to come visit her for a month, because that's what you did. If you were visiting for a month, if you were wealthy enough to get away from work that long, and that they were going to kick the woman's husband out of the bedroom so that the two ladies could share the bedroom together. And you might ask yourself, okay, what are those two ladies doing in the bed together? And that depends on the ladies, right? Carol Smith Rosenberg also points out there's a lot of these women who talked very frankly about how they looked forward to embracing and kissing their friends. You can interpret that in a variety of ways. And people tended not to write, I look forward to touching your genitals, like that. And so we can interpret that as we wish. But I think the significant thing we can consider there is that woman wanted to spend time with her female friend and kick her husband out in order to do this. And the husband went along with it. So there was definitely this idea that your friends fulfill a role in your life. And now, as we get into sort of the mid to late 19th century, we get the idea that your husband should be that friend, should fulfill all of your emotional needs. So he's there as your economic partner, as your sexual partner, as the father to your children, but he's also your best friend and somebody that you want to be with all the time. And we probably all know couples like that, joined at the hip. They never want to be apart from one another. And, my parents married 52 years, holding hands at the mall together to this day. Wonderful, wonderful. And that is sort of a product of this idea of companionate marriage, this idea that your spouse should be the most important person to you, should be fulfilling maybe all of your emotional needs. But that is a lot to ask, and it doesn't always happen that way. By the time we get to the late 19th century, we can look at how courting is starting to fall apart and a new system is emerging. And that system is what we would consider today dating. Now, they didn't necessarily use that phrase in the 1880s or 1890s. That starts to get mapped onto it in the future. But in general, we go from this idea that two people are getting to know one another for the purposes of seeing if they're going to get married, to this idea that two people are going out to have fun together, perhaps seriously, perhaps not. Dating is different from courting in a few ways. It usually takes place outside of the home. Courting often happened in the home. Your significant other would come and visit. He would call upon your family. You would be chaperoned. So your mom or your aunt or your older sister was there kind of watching over you as you're spending time with your significant other. And it was all sort of done under the auspices of the family in the home. Dating is done outside of the home. And there's some pretty good reasons for that. Firstly, in the late 19th century, we start to see with industrialization in the United States, a lot of movement from the countryside to the city. So these farm families that might have had significant space and a parlor where they could welcome visitors, all of a sudden are sharing an apartment with, 8 or 9 people. They don't necessarily have a parlor where they can welcome guests. So you're not going to get as much socialization within the home. You're also, if you are a working class family, not necessarily wanting to invite a whole bunch of people into your apartment where there is a lot of labor going on. Maybe mom does washing, you're cooking for the other 7 kids in the household. Maybe you have boarders, people that pay rent, that help you pay your rent, and they share the place with you. You have very tight, cramped conditions, and you don't necessarily do a lot of your socialization within your home. And now you have all of these options in the big city where you can go out and see the sights. And so we see this movement towards commercial entertainments, things that you go out into the city and you pay some money. They are commercial, they cost money, and that is how you're having your fun. So you might go to the theater. You might go to a dance hall where you pay 5 cents and you can dance all night and they have an orchestra and it's lovely. You might go to an amusement park, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. And eventually you're going to go to the movie theater together. So these are all things that happen outside of the home. These are all things that happen without a chaperone for the most part. So generally speaking, if you are going to the movies, you're not bringing mama along to keep an eye on you. Some families might have tried to do that, but in general, they didn't. So this is a commercial activity where people are going out on a date, and they are doing this independently. This means it costs money, and you have a degree of privacy in that you don't have your family looking over your shoulder, but you also lack a little bit of privacy because you are out in the city with other people. So you're not necessarily going to Inspiration Point like in Happy Days, and you're like making out. That'll come later. We'll get there. But in general, you're going to a place where there are other people there. So perhaps you're on good behavior because you're seeing other people around, but perhaps those people are strangers to you and they might not care if you're sneaking a kiss or sneaking a handhold or something. So there are ways that this would free up people when they're getting to know somebody on a date rather than, in their parlor where they are, under the watchful eye of family members, right? So we have this development of an urban commercial culture. We also have the development of women getting a little bit more independent. We have the women's movement starting in the mid-1840s, demanding more economic rights, the rights to hold jobs, the rights to control their wages if they do have a job. So prior to that, you had a lot of women who might go work in the factory or go do domestic service for somebody, but then they turned their wages over to their father or their husband because those wages technically belonged to whoever the man was who was the head of the household. By the time we get into the late 19th century, women had more control over their property and their wages, which means they might have money to spend. But generally speaking, not as much money as men did. There's a little bit of a wage gap. There was a lot of a wage gap back in the 19th century. And so a lot of young ladies who might have wanted to go out and have some fun, go out on the town, go see a movie, go to an amusement park, didn't necessarily have the disposable income to get that done. But you know who does have that income? The boys. And so if I find a nice boy who wants to take me to a movie, hey, free movie. Do I want to marry that guy? No. Do I want to go to a movie? Yes. I'll go to a movie with this guy. We'll see how it goes. Maybe I like him, maybe I don't. Either way, I got to see that movie. So there's advantages that people would see out of this. But more so than just the economics of, people having wages that they can spend on this was also the idea that girls could go out into the city by themselves. And that was also a pretty shocking concept. This idea of unchaperoned women. That's a new concept and something that was not really expected in more traditional and especially religiously orthodox communities might not want to see that. They see this as a way that women could get into danger, which is true. But also, this is becoming a little bit more common to say, okay, you can go out, but you can go out with a group, or you can go out with this person that we have met at the door and said, okay, he's okay. Right? So you start to see women gaining a little bit more independence. So these farm girls coming to the city to get a job, they see this as an advantage where they have a little bit more freedom. They have money in their pocket. They have, hopefully half a day off. I'm being optimistic for labor laws in the 19th century. And they might be able to experience the fun of the city. And this is actually really interesting when we consider immigrant communities as well. So the late 19th century was a time of massive immigration, especially from Europe into Eastern cities like New York, Boston, Chicago. And a lot of those young girls came over to America, got jobs, and then saw going out into the city and going out and having sort of the nightlife as part of their Americanization process. This is what the American girls are doing. We want to do it too. And one of the very interesting ways we see this is that a lot of young girls who got jobs in domestic service, where they're, working in someone's home, doing the cooking, the cleaning, taking care of kids or something, they wanted to move out of those jobs and get jobs in the factories. Because at the factories, you can meet other people. You can meet girls that you might want to hang out with. You can also meet boys. And that was considered a distinct advantage of those jobs. Factory work still sucked. I don't want to give you any impression that it was great, but it also allowed you a social network in a way that domestic service didn't. And also domestic service often had very nebulous hours. Like if you lived with the family that you were working for, you didn't necessarily have like your evenings off to go out and go on the town. You might not have your weekends off. You're expected to always be on call. Whereas a factory, you clock in and you clock out. And when you're off the clock, go have some fun. So this opens up the option of commercial entertainment and the possibilities of dating, which come with that. Oh, I do want to point out this is a July 1913 Masses magazine. And this group of women, it's entitled The Return from Toil. So this would be a bunch of workers that are off shift. They are done with their work for the day, and they're going to go out and have some fun. So they've got their money in their pockets. Maybe they look to me like they were probably shop girls in a department store. So this is a little bit higher up than working in a factory. But they've got their nice clothes on. They've got their hats on. They're ready to go out and have some fun. And they've got the money to go do that. And maybe they'll meet some boys. Or maybe they'll meet girls. I don't know. They didn't write about that. Okay. So in the 1890s, one place in particular sticks out to me, and this is the one I talk about in my history classes, is Coney Island in New York. And this was an amusement park near Manhattan. So this is in New York City. And this was a public amusement that had all sorts of attractions. So you can go ride the rides. You can go swim on the beach. You can go to like the dance hall that they would have there. They had modern, early time roller coasters. They had bumper cars. They had all sorts of carnival games and everything that the young people especially wanted to go to. So you've got crowds of young people that are sort of meandering around Coney Island, and maybe you went with your beau or your significant other, or maybe you meet somebody while you're there. And then all of a sudden he's like, hey, let's go on the bumper cars together. And you're like, yeah, let's. That sounds like fun. And we get a very interesting situation there because we have sort of this excitement that comes with amusement park rides and roller coasters especially. And so if a young lady is going on a roller coaster with her gentleman and it's very scary because she's never been on a roller coaster before, and she gets very nervous about this, they get up, up to the top, and then it starts going down over the edge and she's like, grabs onto her significant other. Now they're touching. Oh, shocking. Right? So amusement parks are about getting your adrenaline going. Horror movies are about getting your adrenaline going, right? And this is a way to sort of bond with the person that you're there with. You get the blood pumping a little bit, and then, I don't know, maybe some kissing a little bit later on. So we can see that as sort of a way that not only people can meet one another, but people can enjoy themselves together and perhaps get a little up close and personal with one another. And if you're going to the beach, like this gentleman, you got not one, but two fetching young ladies that he is hanging out with on the beach. And they're not even dressed collar to toe in all sorts of clothing, right? So these were revealing costumes when you would go swimming at Coney Island. Very revealing, right? Everybody is shocked. He's exposing his knees. I do love that the ladies are still wearing tights, because heaven forbid you see a bare ankle on the beach at Coney Island. And so my students are always horrified by the idea that these women are going swimming in woolen tights. But yes, they are going swimming in full stockings. That's what you did. But you know, arms are showing, neck is showing. This is a little bit more than you can show when you're walking around town. Here are bumper cars at Coney Island in the 1890s. And so you can see in the bumper cars here, both heterosexual couples and then also two women occasionally sharing the bumper car together. So maybe this is two friends hanging out together, or maybe this is a couple of people who are more interested in each other than they might let on to the outside world. But that was basically seen as an okay thing to do. You want to spend time with your girlfriends, right? And what's the line between your girlfriend and your girlfriend, right? We don't always know. This gives you an opportunity, right? And the men very often are the ones who treat, who pay the way for their young lady to go to a particular attraction or to pay the entrance fee for the park. And so treating becomes the big practice common in dating culture, starting in about the 1890s and on forward, and even into, when I was in the 1990s, when I started dating, this idea that, the boy is going to pay. If he asks, then you can kind of expect him to pay. And I was always a little bit hesitant about that. It's like, why? Because what's he going to expect in return? So if the men are treating, what are the economics of this dating arrangement? The guy, according to the books, according to the etiquette manuals, the guy is paying for the pleasure of the woman's company. That is what treating was all about. But many others looked at this and say, this guy is expecting something in return. You might have to kiss him. You might have to hold hands with him. You might have to do other things, right? There's sort of an expectation of a quid pro quo relationship. Now, that's not everybody's going to go along with that. If a guy says, hey, I took you on the bumper cars, you better kiss me now, might get a slap or might get a kiss, depending on if the person liked the guy. But there was sort of this economic expectation that each side is giving something to the other when you are dating. And nowadays, we use terms like go Dutch, which I think is very interesting because people in the Netherlands will say go American. I thought that was very interesting that the Dutch don't actually consider this to be a very Dutch-centric cultural thing. This is a very American phenomenon. And that reflects also that women make more money nowadays, right? That women make a lot more money than they did back in the 1890s. I can pay my own ticket to a movie theater. I don't need some guy to do that for me. And I would prefer not to be dependent financially on somebody. So I'm not going to do that. So we can see how the culture is changing as the economy is changing, as migrations are changing, as city life is changing. All of these dating practices are also changing. Ooh, I'm running out of time. I haven't even gotten to the good stuff yet. Okay. So in the early 20th century, what was very common was this idea that people wanted to play the field. They weren't courting one person with the goal of getting married. They wanted to have fun. They wanted to go out and experience the wide world. And then maybe a couple of years down the line, they'll get serious and they'll marry somebody. So you saw a lot of dance cards, this idea that a woman would want to have her dance card, which is, who she's going to dance with at the various dances. And she'd want to have a different name under each of the slots there. It's very different than what we see in sort of the post-war world, post-World War II in the 40s and 50s, where if you were going steady with somebody, you'd want to have your dance card just like Billy, 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 Billy. Billy's get all my dancing because he is my boyfriend. We are going steady. We are perhaps courting towards marriage here. And really the mid 20th century is sort of an anomaly if we look at how this works in a lot of different cultural contexts. Here, this is the median age at first marriage for males and females, according to the United States Census Bureau. And we can look at this and say, okay, that 26 to 22 in the 1890s, men married at about 26, women married at about 22. That is dropping in the 40s and 50s and 60s down to about 20 for girls, and about 23 for boys, men, women. But then it starts raising up. And nowadays in the 21st century, we're looking at the late 20s is when people more commonly now get married. And that has a lot to do with this idea of we want to have fun, we want to experience the world, but also we want to extend our education. We're going to college much more frequently now. We're going to grad school often. We want to get arranged in or set up in a career. We want to be able to afford a home. And nowadays, a lot of people are going, I'm never going to be able to afford a home. So why would I wait for that? Maybe I'll just get married anyway. But we can look at a lot of economic reasons and social cultural reasons why the age of marriage dipped in the 1950s, when we have a very prosperous culture, where we have sort of this baby boom going on, where people want to start having larger and larger families. And there's lots of economic reasons, but also, social and cultural reasons for that. After war, people kind of want to reestablish family life and go back to that quote unquote normalcy, when in fact, it's not really the norm. It's something sort of out of touch with the general sense of the trends towards higher marriage rates. And then we get to the 60s. And I will say, for this presentation, I finally read Sex and the Single Girl by Helen Gurley Brown. That was a rough one. I gotta say, don't agree with a lot of what she was saying. But the main concept here, Helen Gurley Brown, who was the editor of Cosmopolitan magazine, one of her big points in Sex and the Single Girl, which was a bestseller in 1962, was that now that you can have a job, now that you are financially independent, you've got a good job, you got your own apartment maybe, go ahead, date like a man. If you want to have sex with somebody, have sex with somebody. Doesn't have to be serious. Don't tie yourself down at an early age. Have your fun, and then, a couple years down the line, then you can get serious if you want. And that was a pretty shocking thing for a woman to write to other women in the 1960s. But perhaps this is also sort of a harbinger of the sexual revolution of the late 1960s. And we see the era of free love and this idea that people are just going to do what feels good. Breaking down a lot of those barriers over things like living together. A couple living together before they get married. Cohabitation is on the rise in the late 60s and on forward. Now, one of the other things that I definitely want to bring up here is how technology has changed this. So previously, I've been talking a lot about economics. I've talked about migrations. I've talked about women's rights. But also, quite frankly, we also have technology that changes the way we date. So if we look at things like the apps nowadays, there's sort of a long history even before that. So newspaper ads, personal ads, seeking matrimony are present from the 1800s on forward. There's even some as early as the early 1700s. I did love a couple of these from the Daily Mail. I found a collection from them. Brunette lady, 38, desires hear from good-natured gentleman owning automobile. Need to have a car. Number one, need to have that car. Object, matrimony. So what are you looking for? Are you looking for somebody who's financially secure? Are you looking for somebody who is of a particular age and wants to have kids? Are you looking for somebody in a particular area? Your local newspaper might be the way you find somebody. And that was a way that people have done for hundreds of years. So it's not necessarily that new that people have used mass communication and technological innovations in order to find their prospective spouse. And nowadays we can look at things like computer dating, which dates back to the 1950s. There was both a Stanford group, like a student group, who set up a computer dating database back in like the late 1950s. Video dating started in the 1960s, where people would record themselves once we have recording technology and say, hey, my name is Courtney and I like long walks on the beach. And then in the 21st century, of course, we have lots and lots of different apps to find whatever you're looking for, whoever you're looking for whatever purpose you are looking for them. So I put up here this is a list of dating apps. Some are real. Which do you think might not be real? Sea Captain Date is real. I was shocked. This is looking like guys on boats looking for ladies, or ladies looking for guys on boats. I guess it could also be ladies on boats. I don't know. Yeah, I do love the mouse mingle for Disney lovers. So you've got that. Naturist passions for the nudist, looking for other nudists, because you're not necessarily gonna, find that everywhere you go. And of course, Trek passions for sci-fi lovers. So I might have to check that out at some point. And now, even now, I realize I'm running over. I'm going to wrap up here. We have a modern return to some past practices. So this idea that, well, dating isn't working very well for us. We're not finding what we're looking for. So maybe we need to go back to the old methods that will help us. And so I recently got obsessed with this show, Indian Matchmaking on Netflix, which is, you can't find somebody you're looking for. You hire a matchmaker. And this is for people in the Indian diaspora, so people in India, in Britain, in the United States, and Canada, and they're looking for somebody, and you put down like, this is what I'm looking for, and she will match you up with somebody. What I find remarkable about this is it's older people, mostly people in their 30s and 40 or so that have tried dating and it hasn't worked, and so they're trying this now. And also, it's not working very well for them because they want more. She gets in, you give her your list of things you're looking for, and she's like, you're never going to find this. You got to compromise. And they're all financially independent people saying, I don't want to compromise. I want this. And if I can't find this, I guess I'll do without. Marriage has in some ways become optional to us. We can be financially self-sufficient. Women can sign credit cards and not have to have a husband do that for us anymore. And so there's less demand for us to get married in most society. There's definitely still social pressures, especially amongst some subcultures. And that's where we also get things like amongst evangelical and fundamentalist communities, sometimes you have sort of these people that are moving away from dating and towards courting again. If any of you have seen the Duggar family on TLC, 19 Kids and Counting, and a lot of sort of hardcore evangelical groups that are saying we don't practice dating, we practice courting. And again, the boy goes to the father and says, I am interested in courting your daughter. And then they proceed from there with the goal of marriage. So you don't want to date around. And one thing that I found was very interesting here is Josh Harris wrote this book when he was 21. Always trust a 21-year-old to know the best. Wrote this book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, about how he doesn't believe in dating anymore and he's only going to court in the biblical way. And a few years later, he renounced all of that and he wrote another book and made a movie called Surviving I Kissed Dating Goodbye, talking about how all of his advice was not effective and that he didn't know what he was talking about, and he's very sorry to all the people that he hurt along the way. And I think basically my wrapping it up here is that there really is no one way to date. You've got lots of different subcultures, lots of different communities, and lots of personal preferences. I mean, if we go back to this, I'm not looking for a wine lover, so I have no interest in Vinny Love. I'm not looking for a nudist, right? But, Trek, maybe. Who knows? I'm open to the possibility. Sea captain? No, I get seasick, right? So what are we after individually is influenced by the larger culture. But now we have so many options out there that we can really sort of find that subculture that works for us. So what does dating look like nowadays? It's very fragmented. There's lots of different ways that people do it. And there's really no one size fits all. So I've got some further reading here, but I wanted to see if anybody had any questions. And Chris has got the microphone. I realize we're over time because I babble too much. But if you do have, I can stick around for a couple minutes if anybody does have some questions. Yeah. Okay, he's coming around with the microphone.
I would think that all of those apps are real.
Yeah, they are. I looked them all up.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. I almost included Banter from, which is the one on Ted Lasso, where you don't get the pictures, you just talk with people. But I figured that was a little too obvious because Ted Lasso is one of the hottest shows on TV right now. And so probably people know that Banter is fake. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, it's good. I'm a big fan. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you all for joining me. Please do pick up a flyer in the back for the VEST lecture if you're interested in that next week. And please join us again next week for Community Conversations when we have gonna get the names right, Ryan Marr and Douglas Detrick presenting Community Guided Creativity. Thank you.
It's so much better. Also, you just need that to skip stuff.